Camp Concordia, Kansas, 1943. A German prisoner of war made an agonizing decision. In a small room at the prison camp, he paced for more than an hour, talking to himself. Eventually, he put his head in a rope hanging from a beam. He was alone. He left a note. Yet when the truth came out, most people saw it as murder. It's the history of murder, and I'm your host, Clare O'Donoghue. The Second World War had been going on in Europe since 1939. The United States joined after Hitler declared war on the U.S. on December 11, 1941. While the Allies obviously welcomed America to the fight, there was another problem they needed help with, according to William Geroux, author of The 15, Murder, Retribution, and the Forgotten Story of Nazi POWs in America.
England was already holding about 500,000 German POWs, and it's a little island nation, and they didn't really have the space or the people or really the excess food to feed like a big prisoner group. And every soldier that you had as a guard was a soldier that couldn't fight on the front lines when it came to that. So the idea was to get them away from the front lines, and America had all of this stuff in abundance.
The UK had been sending some prisoners to Canada, but now the US was an option. Except there was a problem.
We didn't want these guys initially. We didn't want them, any part of them. We'd never done this before, never had large numbers of captured foreign soldiers. And we didn't want to start with these, these fanatical Nazis and bring a whole bunch of them over here. There was this concern that there'd be mass escapes, and they'd be, murdering and pillaging and sabotaging their way across the countrysides.
There had been less than 1,400 German POWs in the U.S. in World War I. Initially, the U.S. agreed to take 50,000 German and Italian POWs in World War II, but no more. That quickly changed as the number of POWs kept rising. Eventually, there would be over 400,000 in the U.S.
We had some parts of military bases that weren't being used and old civilian conservation corps camps that we could, repurpose for this fairly quickly. But the Army was tasked with building hundreds of these things just from scratch, just carving them out of the landscape.
The idea was to put the camps in rural areas, away from highways or waterways, to help prevent escape, which to some seemed an unlikely concern.
Escape from America was almost impossible. You might be able to slip out of the camp, but what do you do then? I mean, you'd have to go find your way across hundreds or even thousands of miles just to get to the ocean. Everybody's after you. There's no underground here for you to hook up with.
Less than 1% of prisoners attempted escape, and most were quickly caught. Aside from the size of the U.S., most POWs didn't know the culture. One escapee was caught when he couldn't figure out how much to pay the waitress at a diner in San Antonio. An escapee from Camp Como in Mississippi sat at the back of the bus in the colored people only section and was quickly identified.
Pretty soon it became clear that people weren't escaping, there weren't all these problems like this, and pretty soon it became clear that these camps were not national security threats, but they were government plums, because there were all these Germans, the enlisted men, could be made to work. And America, a lot of farms and other businesses were desperate for workers. These camps, they became like gifts from the government. You'd have all these young, able-bodied workers that would work for you for a going wage, and which was paid mostly to the government. And cities and, Chamber of Commerces and politicians were competing for these camps like they were new highways or bridges. Build the next camp in my county. No, over in my county.
Before we continue, please remember to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to our channel. It will help us continue to make new content. Now, back to the story.
For the German prisoners coming to the U.S., the shock wasn't being expected to work. It was the U.S. itself.
The Nazi propagandists have been telling them, assuring them that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was devastating American cities the way the Allied bombers were actually devastating German cities. So a lot of the prisoners arrived in the United States expecting to see the New York skyline looking kind of like it did after 9/11, with smoldering and buildings missing or askew. And it wasn't like that at all. And they got to the camps, and the camps were not as they thought. They were told they'd be treated cruelly, they'd be murdered, they'd be tortured or enslaved. And instead, the camps, they were treated pretty well. They were reasonably comfortable quarters. They had plenty of food. They had all sorts of recreational opportunities from playing soccer to arts and crafts. Porter went to a camp somewhere and was surprised to see a full production of the play Faust, complete with a lighting system and a chorus.
When it came to the accommodations the prisoners were in, the camp followed strict rules.
The United States had decided to follow very closely the Geneva Convention, and it said essentially that the POWs had to receive similar accommodations to what American troops on the home front had.
That meant that as prisoners poured into the camps and there weren't enough barracks, tents would be put up to house the overflow. And the same number of American guards would have to give up their barracks and sleep in tents until new prisoner housing was built. This strict adherence to military code was not always viewed favorably by the public.
People in the United States, a fair number of people, and particularly the families of soldiers who were fighting and maybe dying in Europe, didn't like the idea of having these camps in the United States, and certainly didn't like the idea that the Germans were being treated so well. And they thought we were coddling the Germans, and they had their collective name for the camps was the Fritz Ritz.
Despite that, most of the German prisoners did not encounter Americans who felt that way. Quite the opposite.
Once they got out past the barbed wire into the American communities, really small town America mainly, and were working on the farms and working for these businesses, they began associating with the Americans, and they wrote about this, afterwards, and to their families saying, this is very unusual. They're nice to us. They don't hate us. And the Americans, too, some of the reactions, particularly in the German-American sections of the Midwest, a lot of these families, they're trying to keep farms alive, and the POWs come in, and they were greeted almost like long-lost relatives who maybe had made poor life decisions.
When one POW turned 21, he was presented with a birthday cake by the family he worked for.
One farmer wrote about remembering his little son riding on the shoulders of a German POW as the POW playfully, as he put it, playfully goose-stepped through the fields, on the way home from a day's work on the farm. At night, in the evening, sometimes the farm wives would insist that all the POWs that worked on the farm that day, along with the guards, join the family around the dinner table for, fried chicken and mashed potatoes and green beans. And this is an absolute violation of Army regulations. But when you're out in farm in Kansas, it's the farm wife who is in charge.
German POW Gunther Auswald, who was housed at Camp Trinidad in Colorado, recalled a time when the POWs were asked by a beet farmer to sing for his German-born grandmother.
We sang, the old lady cried, and we got lots of food and cigarettes.
Working beside the Americans was changing attitudes, as Gunther would admit in a letter home.
Growing up under the Nazis, we were brainwashed. We considered it perfectly all right to sacrifice ourselves, even our lives, for the fatherland. I began to change my attitude towards Hitler and National Socialism when I met the common American people. They were friendly and open and didn't hesitate to express themselves. They were not filled with hatred towards us. In Nazi Germany, we would never have been allowed to talk and act the way Americans did. Our parents couldn't educate us in the right way because it was too dangerous for them. So what I saw in American civilian society made me think about German society and what I wanted to do with my life.
A lot of these guys, they'd come up through the Hitler Youth as children, and they were true believers in Nazism and in Hitler. But as the German army suffered casualties everywhere, some of the holes already by 1942-43 were being filled in by people who were less enthusiastic. Some of them were nationalists who were not really into all of the Nazi philosophy, but thought, Hitler would make Germany strong. But soon you began to get reluctant draftees. You had people in the German army who had been recruited at the point of a gun, like a Polish soldier whose army had been conquered, and you given a choice, join the German army or we'll shoot you. In the camps, you had kind of a range of feelings about this, about how the war was going, how Nazism and Hitler's leadership was holding up under events. And these people suddenly were thousands of miles away from Germany, and they were seeing America, and some of the Germans' feelings were changing very quickly about this.
But not everyone's feelings were changing. A prisoner at Camp Chaffee in Arkansas wrote to his family,
"The Americans hope to destroy our Nazi convictions. How these poor devils deceive themselves. They do not know us at all."
There was a tension within the German army that would play out as the war turned more and more against Germany. People were thinking, what am I going to do after we lose this war? But it was important to the Nazis that nobody even admit they were in danger of losing the war. If prisoners stepped out of line and did this and seemed to be too friendly with the Americans or helping the Americans, or even seemed to be visibly losing faith in the cause, they would take steps.
The guards were often older men or those recovering from injuries. Most of the day-to-day running of the camp was left to the Germans, who managed meals and ran the in-camp postal service.
At night, the Americans would withdraw from the German barracks and leave the Germans to their own devices. And during that time, in many of these camps, the hardcore Nazis quietly took control. They were the biggest and most aggressive block of prisoners in the group. They sort of imposed their will on the others, the same way they did in Nazi Germany. And they cowed everyone else into going along with them, and they would punish a prisoner that stepped out of line, and they might do it by confining him to his quarters in his free time, or telling the other prisoners to shun him. Or they might threaten, if you don't shape up, we'll get word back to Germany to take it out on your relatives instead of you. Or they might even organize a gang to beat you, to ambush you and beat you within an inch of your life, or beyond that.
In October of 1943, the Nazis went further in the camps than just beating 30-year-old Felix Tropschuh.
He was a German POW in Camp Concordia in a very remote part of Kansas. And he had come over with the Africa Corps, but the real hardcore Nazis, who were the shadow leaders of Camp Concordia, were suspicious of his allegiances, and they kind of kept an eye on him. He wasn't an agitator by any means, but he wasn't, he didn't speak out against Hitler. But they, I think, perceived that his enthusiasm was not there, and one of them finally stole his diary and read it, and they turned it over to the Nazi leadership, and in it he'd made some comments that Hitler was going to be the ruin of Germany.
Tropschuh was brought up before a court made up of Nazi prisoners, and he was convicted of disloyalty. The sentence was death. But his fellow prisoners would not be the ones killing him. They wanted Tropschuh to do that himself.
If you don't do it, we will get word back to Germany for your wife to be killed in your place. And whether they could actually do that was a little unclear, but anyone who had grown up in Nazi Germany could never dismiss something like that, out of hand. Tropschuh paced apparently in his quarters trying to decide, but finally hanged himself. So that was the first, it was not technically a murder or one they could prove, but it was at the very least a forced suicide. He was the first killing of these that the army recognized.
But not right away. When his body was discovered, the guards initially thought it was self-inflicted.
There was a little note found by the body. None of the Germans would speak. None of them claimed to know anything that happened. They went ahead and buried Tropschuh, and the Germans, uncharacteristically, would have no part of the burial. They didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't attend the service. They wouldn't provide a flag. They didn't want anything to do with it. It seemed a little suspicious, but they didn't have anything. Afterwards, some informants, including some officers from the Africa Corps, came forward and told the American authorities what really happened. Even some of the people who had gotten along okay with the Nazis before that were appalled by the way that Tropschuh was killed.
Apparently, some members of the Kangaroo Court had watched through the window as Tropschuh made up his mind. And that was one of the reasons that other POWs came forward with the truth.
Just the sheer cruelty of it were just too much for some of these guys, even guys who had seen a lot and who had signed off on a lot. This taking place to a fellow German in a camp in the middle of the cornfields of north central Kansas was just too much.
The POW court that passed sentence on Tropschuh wasn't an isolated event. In camps throughout the country, similar courts were being set up to pass judgment on their fellow prisoners.
It really varied, but it was usually a panel of officers or leaders in the camps who would had appointed themselves the arbiters of what was proper behavior. And depending on the camp and depending on the people, you could get assaulted or you could get murdered for working too hard at your job, working harder than the Geneva Convention required you to do.
A month after the death of Felix Tropschuh, a former machinist from Hamburg named Johannes Kunze was found dead in the camp mess hall of Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma. A report was made of the condition of the room.
We found blood stains on the eastern side of the mess hall, a milk bottle covered with blood, blood stains on the door leading into the mess hall. Coming into the kitchen, we found a shovel that had been used to scrape blood stains from the wall.
The coroner reported that Kunze had been beaten and attacked with a meat cleaver. Unlike Tropschuh's death, there could be no doubt that this was murder. And for those in charge of the camps, that meant finding the killers.
Would have been easy to brush these aside and just say, this is just bad guys killing bad guys. We don't have to get too involved with this. But they actually made an attempt to solve these cases.
Leon Jaworski, a 29-year-old lawyer, had been the youngest person at 20 ever admitted to the Texas bar.
He was a hard-charging lieutenant colonel with the Army's JAG Corps, the Judge Advocate General's office. He was a courtroom prosecutor for the Army.
He would later explain the importance of JAG stepping in to prosecute crimes in POW camps.
The killings had escalated to a point where the United States was gravely concerned. It looked like we were losing control.
He was assigned to investigate and prosecute the case involving the death of Johannes Kunze. A reporter who watched Jaworski during the investigation said the lawyer's, quote, steady eyes and calm, unassuming manner were reassuring, unquote. And they were also watchful. It came out that Kunze had been passing notes to the doctor, sharing information he'd gleaned from other POWs. When a new doctor was in camp and received the note, not knowing German, he didn't understand the significance and gave it to another POW, who immediately realized that Kunze was spying. 32-year-old Walter Beyer, whose rank was equivalent to a first sergeant, was the highest-ranking POW in the camp. He gathered the other prisoners into the mess hall very late one night on November 4th, 1943, and told them he had an announcement.
Comrades, I'm sorry and it hurts my soul to tell you this, but as it may seem, we have a traitor in our company.
He read the note, which suggested targets for Allied bombings in Kunze's hometown of Hamburg. It also said, quote, the main railroad station was camouflaged as a house block with dummies and paint. Through the center, a light strip was marked like a street, unquote. The room erupted. Then Beyer called Kunze forward and had him compare the handwriting on the note to a letter Kunze had just written to his wife, likely confiscated from the camp post office, which was run by the prisoners. Though Kunze wouldn't say it, it was clear. The handwriting matched. Beyer apparently admonished his fellow prisoners not to hurt Kunze.
We will have the Americans on our backs.
But no one in the room listened. They attacked Kunze quite viciously, leaving his lifeless body in the mess hall, made a vague show of cleaning up, and then returned to their barracks. In the morning, when Kunze's body was found, everyone in the camp was lined up and checked for signs of a struggle. 13 men had blood on their clothes and were held for questioning. 5 of those men from the Africa Corps made what would later be seen as incriminating statements. They included Walter Beyer, 30-year-old Berthold Seidel, 23-year-old Hans Demme, and 27-year-old Hans Schumer, all sergeants, and 22-year-old Willie Schultz, a corporal. Each man confessed to playing some role in the beating, but none confessed to dealing the final blow.
A couple of the guys clearly had been involved in the beating that left the victim dead, but a couple of them had very little to do with it.
Hans Schumer, a cook in the mess hall, had done the least of anyone who admitted to being involved.
There was a big crowd there. He couldn't get anywhere near the victim, and he worked in the kitchen, so he saw some friends grabbing like cups, coffee cups, and throwing them at the victim, and he said he grabbed a couple and threw them, but they missed. Hit one guy in the back and some other guy in the back, and the other missed everything.
3 of the men admitted to throwing punches, but said that Kunze had still been standing when they left the mess hall. Beyer told investigators that he had found out Kunze was a spy, but said he had not ordered him killed.
It is the understanding among German soldiers that a traitor should be killed, but not in enemy internment camps.
Beyer wanted the investigation and trial to wait until the men returned to Germany.
A lot of the Africa Corps guys, before their own defeat, the German army had just been rolling over its enemies, so they had a hard time imagining Germany being defeated. The ones that still believed that Germany was going to win this and that these guys are eventually going to roll out of these camps and take over the United States, or at least be able to just stroll home or something like that, it got harder and harder to keep these guys in line.
The Geneva Convention allowed for POWs to be tried under the laws of the United States, and the War Department saw the death of Johannes Kunze as a test case. Leon Jaworski agreed, writing that if Kunze's murder went unpunished,
it would have been equivalent to licensing the Nazi government that operated in every camp.
Though many men were involved in the beating, only 5 were charged. Beyer, who had rounded up the men, Seidel, Demme, and Schultz, who admitted to punching him, and Hans Schumer, who had thrown a cup. The next question was where to try them.
All the Geneva Convention said was you can do it according to the American justice system. They didn't say where, so we didn't do it in the civilian courts because we thought that they're too unpredictable. Who knows what they'll do? We didn't even do it in the regular military courts. We did it in these secret U.S. military tribunals in which the general in charge of that sector of the United States would handpick maybe a dozen officers to serve as the judge and jury in this case. And they have a court-martial. It's all behind closed doors. It's all in secret. And they have prosecutors like Jaworski, but there were other prosecutors in these cases, and defense attorneys who were always American lawyers in the JAG Corps who had been, I don't know if they had volunteered, I think in some cases they did, but who had been assigned to defend these German POWs. And they, most of them, gave it a good shot, but it's tough to get anybody off in a situation like that.
Before a case could be brought against them, there were murders at other POW camps. On March 12, 1944, former U-boat crewman 21-year-old Werner Dreschler was found hanging from a rope in the shower at Camp Papago Park in Arizona. He'd been at the camp for 6 hours.
He was a known informant, a stool pigeon. Inexplicably, the Army had stuck this guy in the middle of a barracks full of U-boat men, many of whom knew what he had been about, and within hours he had been hanged in a rather public way in the main washroom.
those 7 men would also be tried for murder. Hugo Kraus, a 25-year-old corporal, was beaten in his cot at Camp Hearn, Texas. He died several days later. He'd been born in Germany and raised in New York. He joined the German army, but now a POW, he made clear he would stay in the U.S. after the war, which he openly said Germany would lose. A POW in Arkansas was beaten to death for working harder at his job outside the camp than was required. Another POW was killed because of his preference for jazz, which was seen by some of his fellow prisoners as being pro-American.
There are some people who described this feeling like they were constantly watched. You had to watch everything you said, everything you did, because at night somebody might come calling for you.
The War Department and prosecutors like Leon Jaworski saw the violence in the camps getting worse.
The Army classified them as 5 clear murders and 2 forced suicides. But there were dozens of other deaths that were classified as suicides.
It's been estimated that as many as 167 deaths were caused by other prisoners, and the Army was struggling to find a way to stop it.
They didn't quite know how to handle it or what to do, and they did what the Army sometimes does, and just decided to just jam its foot down and turn the prosecutors loose and say, find out who did this and make them pay. And they also thought that this was, if we don't do this, is this going to get worse? We got to make an example of these guys, because there's, again, almost 400,000 of these German POWs. And if they get used to the idea that you can commit murders and here and there, if somebody gets out of line, what other problems?
Eventually, they began screening the POWs, moving the more pro-Nazi prisoners to Camp Elva in Oklahoma, leaving the ordinary German soldiers in peace. The trial of the 5 men who were charged with killing Johannes Kunze was in January 1944. After detailing Kunze's substantial injuries, Jaworski turned to the statements of the 5 men, telling the 11 officers who made up the jury.
They tell a story of cruelty and barbarity that I know is shocking to this court.
Even Hans Schumer, the cook who threw a cup that didn't even hit Kunze, fit this description, said Jaworski.
He was there. It isn't the actual striking of a man under those circumstances. It is the participation in those acts, the accumulation, that leads to the death of the victim.
The men had a simple defense. No one could say who actually threw the fatal blows. And even if they could, they hadn't done anything wrong.
Their argument was, yes, we killed this guy, but we didn't commit murder because he was a traitor. What are we supposed to do? We can't report him to the Americans. They're working with him. They'll move him somewhere else. The only thing we could do to stop him from betraying our country was murder him.
Jaworski also told the court that the information in the note Kunze passed to the doctor was not top secret. It was useless, actually. It was from a 1941 issue of Life magazine. On January 25, 1944, despite at least 13 men being involved in the beating, the 5 men on trial were the ones convicted and sentenced to death.
The only ones that Jaworski was able to convict were the ones that were either naive or so sure of the rightness of what they had done that they just couldn't keep quiet. All 5 of them, the only evidence against them was their own statements.
Jaworski had an answer to that.
We can't get all of the men that were guilty. You never do when you have a mob. But we've got a number of them, and it isn't our fault that more were not gotten.
A total of 15 German POWs would eventually be convicted in military courts and sentenced to death for murders at camps around the country. But carrying out those sentences was complicated.
The Swiss volunteered before the war to be the intermediary on, among other things, all matters relating to the treatment of POWs. So the Swiss would visit the camps regularly, or were supposed to, and would listen to complaints, and any complaints that our government had about the way our guys were being treated, they'd pass on to the Germans, and they were They were our go-between. There was no direct communication between us and the Germans about prisoners. It all came through the Swiss.
The Geneva Convention had required 3 months' notice before executions, and though the War and State Departments did send notice of the convictions, the information on the specifics of the cases was sparse.
We had done this months before, and we're not telling them anything, and we could have done a better job. We were just had our backs up and said, we don't have to tell you anything about this, and they were demanding and everything, so negotiations went very poorly.
Some within the Roosevelt administration worried about the effects the convictions would have on American POWs in Germany, as they were already worried about their treatment.
At the beginning of the war, the Germans had made an effort to treat them according to the Geneva Convention. The facilities weren't like the Fritz Ritz in America, but they were being fed according to the rules, more or less, and the housing. But as the war went on, different things happened. The SS got a greater role in the camps. The German populace began having shortages of food and supplies that would go to the camps. So the Germans, toward the end of the war, were violating the Geneva Convention in some ways, but in many ways they were doing it because they couldn't give supplies to the POWs that they didn't have to give to their own people.
By early 1945, massive Allied bombings targeting both military sites and civilian populations were leading many to conclude that Germany was heading toward defeat.
The American authorities were very concerned because they were holding tens of thousands of prisoners, American prisoners, and by then they know that Hitler's a madman. So how long is he going to be treating our guys better than he's treating the Russians, particularly when he starts to get desperate?
Once the German lawyers saw the convictions in the Kunze murder, they demanded the executions, scheduled for just weeks after the notice, be halted. They didn't wait for an answer. Instead, they did something drastic. In December of 1944, the German Army and SS charged 15 American POWs with interfering with the operations of the Third Reich. William Schaefer, a child of German immigrants born in Illinois, had served in World War I, then went to West Point, and at 43 was lieutenant colonel when he was captured by the Germans. At 6'4", broad-shouldered and square-faced with a gruff personality, he'd been given the nickname King Kong by enlisted men. But he wasn't just physically imposing. The men who served with him praised his intellect and his brilliance as a tactician. In November of 1943, Schaefer was put in isolation and interrogated repeatedly. His cell was small and his rations were smaller. He lost so much weight, he said his pants went around him a second time. 30-year-old James Schmitz was also from Illinois, but unlike Schaefer, he was described as friendly. Someone said, quote, his personality was that of a rural politician, unquote. Both men were eventually sent to Oflig 64 in Poland, where thanks to Red Cross packages, Schaefer finally had enough to eat. Though according to fellow prisoners, he often and loudly complained, seeing it as his duty as a POW to make his captors unhappy. Colonel Henry Spicer, a 35-year-old airman from Colorado, was captured in March of 1944 when his plane was shot down in France. He was taken to a POW camp in Germany where he was, unsuccessfully, interrogated. His interrogator was Hans Scharf, known as a master at finding information with casual conversation that hid pointed questions. But in Spicer, he met his match. He would later call the man a character and said, quote, he made a fool of me, good and solid, unquote. When a shower bar went missing at the prison camp, Spicer gathered his men at the request of the camp commandant, who was standing next to him.
Lads, as you can see, this isn't going to be a fireside chat. Someone has taken a steel bar off the south latrine door. The Germans want this bar back. We have tried to find it, and I've tried to find it.
He flashed a V for victory sign and continued for several more minutes. and what he said was not at the camp's request.
As far as I am personally concerned, I would be very happy to rot in this hole for the next 10 years if during the meantime the German army is being wiped off the face of the earth.
Spicer was almost immediately placed in the cooler.
Lieutenant Schaefer and Schmitz had briefly, as a symbolic act, stood in front of a German sergeant who was trying to post, and eventually just did post, a kind of a nasty propaganda poster on the POW's bulletin board. They didn't prevent him from doing it. They jumped right out of the way as soon as he, said, get out of the way.
Spicer, Schaefer, and Schmitz were charged with interfering with the Third Reich. 4 American officers who did not follow the guard's orders to move off a sidewalk on a visit to a dentist were also charged. Another POW got into a scuffle with a guard and was charged. Others were charged with being spies, which in a couple of cases was actually true. All the men, 15 in total, were convicted and sentenced to death.
In no cases had they injured the guard or had things got out of control. These were cases that under normal circumstances, I mean, it's a serious offense at a POW camp, and you might get sentenced to a couple years in prison or something for something like that in the middle of war. But to be sentenced to death for it is, way beyond the pale. So I would say most of these cases, a couple of them were the case of the guys briefly standing in front of the poster, or maybe giving a speech is absurd.
On the morning of January 9th, 1945, a telegram arrived from Berlin through the Swiss. The Germans wanted a trade. 5 of the American POWs for the 5 German POWs convicted of Kunze's murder.
They sentenced all of the guys, all the 15 of our guys, to death in the course of 2 days in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge on December 29th and 30th, 1944. Just in one fell swoop, sentenced them all to death. So they didn't tell us anything about that until a telegram in early January, the first week in January, saying basically, we'll trade you some of these guys for some of the guys in Fort Leavenworth, some of the German POWs that you're holding. We'll trade you for some. And then the negotiations went on from there. And they're kind of fitful and very odd negotiations. At one point, the Germans said that one of the prisoners they were holding, one of the spies, that's worth 2 of the Germans at Fort Leavenworth. At another point, we proposed a big exchange of 15 Germans at Leavenworth for 15 Americans at two points along the Swiss border. So these were the negotiations that were going on, and it was by then the communication system in Germany was failing, so it was becoming harder and harder to get a response from the right people, or to get the latest statement of your position through.
The POWs on both sides awaited their fate while negotiations sputtered through the collapse of Germany and the end of the war. After FDR's death in April of 1945, Harry Truman had become president, and the question of the POWs was now up to him.
Then it comes to him, what do we do with these guys?
The war ended in Europe on May 8th, 1945, before the question was answered.
There was some suggestion that maybe now that the war was over, we didn't have to go ahead and hang these guys. One Army official in particular was determined that we follow through with this, so they wrote and got Truman's approval. He signed the death warrants, because after all, these were, the crimes themselves were very brutal crimes.
But first, the 15 Americans had to be secured.
Rather quickly at the end, these POW camps were overrun by our troops, by British troops, by Canadian troops, by Russian troops. So the whole idea of holding 15 Americans for an exchange just collapsed by the way that the war was unfolding so quickly and so chaotically. So the Army set out to make sure that all 15 of the Americans were out of enemy hands. They had like a little checklist. They knew that the 15 guys they wanted. And whenever somebody in a far-flung command would report they'd liberated a camp, they'd say, "Did you find this guy?" So when they finally figured that all 15 of the Americans were safe, they set the wheels in motion to start hanging the Germans at Fort Leavenworth.
Unlike the treatment POWs had gotten from Americans during the war, by mid-1945, things were different.
There was not a lot of sympathy. After we defeated Nazi Germany, many of the horrors of what Nazi Germany had come were still being revealed to us on a daily basis, with discovery of what was going on in some of these camps. So the sympathy for Nazis and any Germans in America was at low ebb.
Truman commuted one POW sentenced to 20 years, though he was released in 3 and sent home. The other 14 were set to be executed.
We just announced that we were going to hang them and did so at Fort Leavenworth in 3 different groups. We didn't hang them like all together at the same time. We hanged them one right after the other and hanged the last 7 just in the space of just a little more than 2 hours. The Army allowed some reporters to attend the hangings, and they wrote about them in considerable detail. So from that, I was able to reconstruct, what had actually done and what the last words of the different people, or their last, their manner as they left. And most of them were very stoic.
Walter Bayer, who admitted to unmasking Johannes Kunze, but swore he did not participate in the killing, had one last thing to say before he was executed.
I can't see why this is being done to me.
The 14 men were buried at Leavenworth. Leon Jaworski, who had convicted the men, would go on to become the second special prosecutor in the Watergate scandal. The camps were closed, and the German POWs returned to Germany, though somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 came back to the U.S. in the years after the war as immigrants and free men. What do you think about this case? Please comment below. And if you liked this story, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like and notification buttons, and let us know if there are any cases you'd like us to cover.